So after a couple of very inspiring panels, we're going for the trifecta with a panel on historical and geographical solidarities. I do hope, one of the things that solidarity depends upon is ingesting caffeine. So I do hope you managed to get some coffee, because it's been quite a long day, right? And we will move straight from this panel to the keynote, which will be the last event of today. And then I wanted to reiterate that tomorrow we reconvene at 11 o'clock in 6112 of this building. That's the 6th floor, 6112, for our breakout sessions, which basically takes some of the discussion that was begun in our panels and expands upon it and allows much more input from you, the audience. And by the end of those sessions, we will have figured out socio-political transformation, and the world will change almost immediately. I jest. I'm just trying to see who's asleep. Okay. So without further ado, I'll introduce our panel members, and they will speak in the order that they appear on the program. First is Seygan Gökçek from Bogazici University, Istanbul. Seygan was a former fellow at the Center for Place, Culture and Politics, and so I'm sure he now blames us for all the thinking that he has at this point. Next to him is Robyn Spencer, who's also a former fellow of the Center for Place, Culture and Politics, and just recently published a fantastic book on the Black Panthers. Then Jasmina Husanovic from the University of Tuzla in Bosnia. And last but not least, Oscar Otzoy from the Coalition of Immokalee Workers. Robyn Spencer.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm so happy to be here, and I'm happy to see you out here today. Today, I want to offer some thoughts on the question of what can be learned from solidarity in the past, especially when contingent solidarity in the present regards such history with justifiable incredulity. So thinking about the history of solidarity, what has it meant historically, and then how can we take from those examples and use it to advance the conversation around global linkages and support for struggle in this contemporary moment. So I want to start by thinking about the history of the Black Panther Party as one of the leading organizations of the civil rights and Black Power movement. So founded in 1966 in Oakland, California by Huey Newton and Bobby Seale, the Black Panther Party would grow from its humble origins as a group of 6 young men who knew each other from the neighborhood, but who had been politicized by the, I just hear some feedback, I'm not sure if that's from my,
This one's off. Turn it off.
Yeah, an organization that was grounded by 6 young men who knew each other from the Oakland neighborhood, who had been politicized by their involvement in various grassroots organization and struggle, who had read and been influenced by international revolutionaries like Fidel Castro, like Mao Zedong, Frantz Fanon as well. So the Panthers grew from that origin of 6 young men to an organization that women would eventually join and play a big role in. And in a lot of ways, the Panthers would become the model for Black revolutionary activism in the period. They practiced an anti-capitalist orientation. They focused on developing community programs within the communities that they served, starting in Oakland and then growing around the country and then eventually around the world, from the humble 6 members to thousands of people, to first 6 men to majority women as the organization evolved. One of the things the Panthers were known for, in addition to critiquing capitalism, was also to have a staunch anti-imperialist program. So they very much were connected to movements for African liberation, and especially around the Vietnam War. So in a lot of ways, when we think about the Panthers, it's important to kind of bring back their solidarity politics, because they, not only did they inspire a lot of people. I'm not sure. Is it my iPad?
Both off. It's off. Do you want to switch?
That could work.
Microphones?
You're walking with such purpose that.
Start talking about these politics, man.
The microphones have risen up. So when we think about the Panthers, it's also important to think about not just their anti-capitalist politics, but also their anti-imperialist politics as well. How did they look at the world and make deep political connections between the realities of what was happening on the ground in the US and the global context? So what I want to offer today are some remarks on thinking about how the Panthers' desire and ability to take the revolution that they were trying to make in the United States through community development programs, through education with their newspapers and their schools, through radical politics. They ran for third-party candidates in the 60s. They ran for office later on as well. How did they try to transform that into an international movement? It's very important, especially since we're there in this year as well. There's also lots of commemorations of Global 68 and the uprisings around the world, and how do we put the Panthers in the context of those larger movements? First thing to note is that when the Panthers went abroad, part of it was due to the realities of repression. It wasn't just ideological orientation or proclivity. In some ways, it was an act of self-defense, a way for them to gain solidarity and support for themselves, as well as offer it to groups and organizations around the world that they felt were in line with this idea of global revolution. So in this time period, we can say the Panthers were looking to secure global alliances. Some of the leaders had made their first visits to Japan. Some had secured exile in Cuba. But repression was what added the urgency to the Panthers' international thrust. In 1967, the FBI launched COINTELPRO, the counterintelligence program that was aimed at exposing, neutralizing, disrupting, misdirecting, discrediting Black nationalists, what they called hate-type organizations. Important to note that at this time, actual hate-type organizations were pretty much left untouched by the FBI in this period, and the Panthers and other Black nationalist groups received the brunt of the FBI's surveillance, harassment, and infiltration in this period. The Panthers were dubbed the most violence-prone organization, and they were tracked not just by the FBI, which I think is a well-known story, but also by the CIA, which I think is less well-known. In a lot of ways, the surveillance that the Panthers faced in their headquarters, things like the warrantless telephone surveillance and things like that, when you look back in the archives, the records are pointing to that being a necessity, not just for their domestic actions, but for their international potential, the potential of their international activities. The Attorney General at the time feared that the group's alliances abroad and the way that they were able to travel around the world and make connections with revolutionary groups made them dangerous, that those groups would in fact finance revolution in the United States. The Attorney General said, quote, that the Panthers had, quote, avenues for channeling foreign funds into the country for the purpose of supporting Black Panther Party revolutionary activities, which included the advocacy of the violent overthrow of the existing federal and state government structures. And so in a very real way, when we think about solidarity and what it meant for the Panthers, we kind of have to understand it in that light. Now, what did they do? Where did they go? What was their response? And what can we learn from it? So one of the ways that the Panthers sort of translated their desire for these international connections was really to join a wave of activism against the Vietnam War. So in a lot of ways, the Panthers were able to take some of their locally focused and domestic activism and propel it into the world and to amplify the ways in which African Americans in particular, especially within the military, who oftentimes call themselves Mau-Maus within the military structure, were very interested in making these political connections, not just with Kenya, which is where Mau-Mau had originated, but with other parts of the other entities and groups that were also involved in anti-Vietnam work. One of the less well-known angles of this was a group in Sweden called Scan-SNEC, which was the Scandinavian version of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which used a lot of Panther iconography. And it was a way for activists in that region to literally translate Panther politics, speeches from Malcolm X, important articles in the Panther newspaper, and to use that material to educate people to support the Panthers as well. The Panthers had an international coordinator in Scandinavian countries named Connie Matthews, and she would mobilize and organize people to protest at U.S. embassies in Scandinavian countries when Panthers were on trial in the United States, to amplify the way in which this critique of the U.S.'s role in the world was not just about the Panthers being harassed on a domestic level by structures of state policing, but making a connection between the military, the army, and the U.S. as a global cop, and what was happening to the Panthers in their communities around policing, to sort of make that connection real. Another element of their solidarity efforts is that they created an international embassy in Algeria, and they made really concrete connections with activists there. I want to play a short clip from an interview I did with Sekou Odinga as part of the campaign to bring Mumia home. Our interview attempts to recover oral histories of revolutionary activists while they're still with us. I interviewed Sekou Odinga, who was part of the Black Panther Party here in New York, who went to Algeria and sort of enacted the Panther solidarity efforts. So I wanted to sort of bring that historical figure to life with just a short 3-minute clip, and then I'll continue on with thinking about the Panthers in other ways.
I had a little bathroom window about 18 by 12, and next to the window was one of those cement would come out and see a window because there was turned out to become like an embassy there actually. No way down that they could see, but that pipe was right there. So I was able to escape from them and go underground. Go underground, basically, what I mean is change my name, change my persona, and continue to live. While underground, I got orders to go to Algeria and help the Minister of Information, Aldrich Cleveland, establish an information center there, what turned out to become like an embassy there, actually. And that's what I did. I did that because I was told to do that. The idea was to disseminate information about what we were doing here in the struggles of the United States, especially what the Black Panther Party was doing and other revolutionary organizations, and to assimilate information from other revolutionary struggles around the world, and try to bring it back and send it back to the U.S. through our papers and through our other media about what was going on in other areas of the struggling world, and so that people here would know that people in Africa, people in Latin America, people in Asia were going through the same thing. So what we're trying to do is link our struggle up with world struggle.
What was your first month like in exile?
Yeah. I didn't see that, but it was different. It was a different country. Most of the people spoke different languages. They spoke Arabic and French there, and I couldn't speak either. So it had its difficulties, but it was good in a lot of other ways. You know, we were meeting revolutionary people from around the world, people who were struggling, and we were learning about other people's struggle and learning about other experiences that people were going through. We were meeting people, we were making friendships, we were making comrades around. So on one level it was difficult, but on another level it was very good.
So it seems that your activities internationally involve meeting with a lot of different people from other parts of the world, revolutionaries, etc. An example of some of your activities.
That was a picture of us in our embassy in Algeria. That was just Cleveland, D.C. Constant. At the time, it was the head of the PLO, Yasser Arafat, and I was kneeling behind there. But that's what it was, meeting with people, you know, talking about what we can do to help each other.
Now, one of the things,
I'm just going to pause there because that's really what I wanted to show. This is on YouTube if you want to learn more. I just want to keep going with some more global remarks.
So when you think about what the Panthers did, I think I'll just leave it there. Maybe that's it's pretty strong. When you think about what the Panthers did, I mean, he just gave you an example of how they tried to enact this type of solidarity politic and the larger impact it had. You'll note that much of it had to do with support and also education, taking the knowledge that they got and bringing it back home to educate people around what was happening in the world at the time. And that was very, very important and key to what the Panthers did. Now, there were definitely challenges to solidarity as well. One of the challenges he mentioned, language, right, cultural difference, also different political analysis. The Panthers found that when they went to Europe, their ideas of a Black-led revolution and a class struggle that was connected integrally to a racial struggle, a racial capitalism, if you will, was challenged oftentimes by different understandings about the separation between class and race and where the real heart of oppression lay and what type of action was necessary to achieve this revolution. So when they went on the ground and went beyond the larger umbrella of solidarity politics and began to have those interactions, those were very generative for the organization in that they had to begin to redefine for themselves, for their readers, and to sort of imagine themselves as part of this more global conversation, escaping that American exceptionalism or this, all of the ways in which the context of the U.S. had shaped what even they had thought was possible and even how they interacted with larger ideas. Of course, they faced the reality of anti-Blackness within communities and organizations that would seem to be natural allies for them, but they found that those communities had absorbed also and practiced different ideas and elements of anti-Blackness, so they had to confront and struggle around those issues as well. And I think it brings us to this larger question of, well, what lessons can we take away from what the Panthers did? And I think that today we're at a moment with lots of solidarity talk, less solidarity action. I feel like the idea of solidarity as a verb, something that is enacted, not just a stance, but not just a commitment, but something that gets expressed in organizational politics is less less well practiced. You know, so people will talk about solidarity all day, but then do they attempt other languages? Do they connect with actual people from the, movement or struggle that they are invested in supporting? Oftentimes, those opportunities seem to be limited. So one of the lessons I think of the Panther solidarity efforts is to push past that and to have this kind of organizational linkage, because they were in an organization, they were able to do that. And I want to end with ideals about Palestinian solidarity, because I mean, you mentioned it. Maybe it'll be a through line throughout our comments today, but because we saw the last image there of Sekou Odinga with Yasser Arafat and the other Panthers there. I think the question of Palestinian solidarity is very, very real, and we have definitely now a moment of heightened Black Palestinian solidarity. And what I'm finding is that in many ways, despite the generative tensions and synergies within that, in a lot of ways, I think it calls on a very, very real reckoning about power and access. Because what I found is that when you move into Palestinian solidarity as an individual, you find that you sometimes can be actually used to replace the Palestinian voice, right? That you become almost the symbol that people want to hear from, rather than the actual person who is, who can tell you, in a real sense, like Sekou Odinga did, about what was it like to be there, what is happening to my family, my community, what kind of access don't I have anymore? So I find that as someone who is part of that larger movement, I went on a delegation, et cetera, it's very important to kind of reduce, to sort of challenge the seduction of solidarity, right? There's sometimes it's almost as if it can become about you as versus replacing your voice and passing the mic to someone who may not have that voice, especially at the time, at times of crisis. I mean, I think if you're invested in Palestinian solidarity work, you realize that the crisis is ongoing, the war is every day, but there are moments where it may bubble up into the news and make national headlines. Now it's being passed around, on Facebook, in moments where maybe you were posting about it and no one cared. Now everyone's posting about it, then they'll go away, then you'll keep posting. It's the cycle of the news cycle and the realities of social media. But just thinking about, again, sort of how to decenter oneself, thinking about the role of repression in solidarity, just like the Panthers faced repression. One of the things that allies can do is, of course, take on, be more visible, and to sort of take the brunt, I guess one can say, of being able to speak out and having less to lose than someone who can't even make that stance, for example. So that's another, I think, very real way. So solidarity may feel romantic, but it means that you have to go out on a limb, right? And you have to realize that even as you're out there on the limb, you're there in support of people who can't even be on a limb, who are beyond, that kind of possibility and need that kind of support. So thinking about not just the individual imperative of solidarity, but solidarity as the solidarity practices idea. I really like that, thinking about, well, what are you practicing around solidarity? If you're interested in what's going on around the world, whether it be Fees May Fall, Palestine, whatever, are you supporting an organization? Are you part of an organization that's doing that? And if you are you supporting and partnering with Palestinian-led organizations? Are you replacing your voice with their voice as much as possible? Because people may come and ask me to talk that may not ever ask an actual Palestinian person to come and talk. And if asked, they may worry of all of the backlash and repression of raising their voices. So keeping all of that in mind, I think, is very significant in terms of solidarity practice. And I think that the Panthers kind of give us a model for that, because they put themselves in other contexts. They spoke to and connected with, they focused on education. I think we have to accept the miseducation of daily life in the United States and constantly be countering that with real news, real facts, a deeper understanding of, current events, especially when it comes to U.S. foreign policy and what's happening in the world. So the simple act of educating oneself and other people is very important. I think sometimes it's easy to be a solidarity activist, harder to talk to the actual people in your world around, you know, what you're doing, around being critical of the news and changing the way that they see their relationship to the state, and also connecting to the larger structures of resistance and building across those barriers. So I think the Panthers were successful in doing that despite all of the restrictions that they face. So it becomes, I think, a model. It didn't mean that there weren't problems or issues, but oftentimes today, when solidarity can feel like a life or death imperative, we sometimes get hung up on all of the barriers and the complications, and sometimes it's just a matter of life and death. You know, in some context, in some historical moment, in some places in the world right now, it's really at that level. And so solidarity is really something to, you know, to be enacted in practice, in a verb kind of way. So I'm going to end with that. Thank you.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm really happy to be here, and I want to thank Mary for inviting me. I come from the University of Tuzla this academic year. I'm at Stanford University for Fulbright, but apart from being an academic, I've been involved in the activist scene in former Yugoslav region since 1992 at least. Feminist peace activism, but also in the post-war period, other kinds of resistances to dominant representations and ways of understanding what's happening and what has happened and is still happening in Yugoslav's successor states, including Bosnia and Herzegovina, where we also had the most catastrophic experiences in terms of human loss and terror and genocide, etc. So in that sense, Bosnia kind of tells is the extreme, is the limit case, telling us something important about what I call the twin logic of victimization and commodification. Because when we look at how the whole story of former Yugoslavia has developed, we see that basically victimization functions in the political economy overall as commodification. Victim is a commodity, and trauma and genocide and this extreme political violence and atrocity, they produce surplus value, and it's, for us, I think, very important to concentrate on those things. So a bit more about Bosnia. So just after the, I want to say that it's hurting me, I can't. Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Who knew?
How clever. Okay, so it's important to note here that in the middle of the war in 1994, without anyone knowing, the elites, the ethno-nationalist elites in Bosnia and Herzegovina changed the law on property without any kind of public debate, and they opened the door to privatization. Obviously, Bosnia was a socialist country, part of socialist country before that, and all property was social property, the so-called. It's neither private nor public. There was also a third form of property called social property. So a lot of things, including factories and schools, were social property, not just belonging to the public, to the state, sorry, but actually to society, workers and citizens. Through a self-management system. So they changed this, and it's interesting also to note how the politics of humanitarian aid was directly connected to privatization, i.e. the conditions for getting reconstruction and humanitarian aid was to privatize your public resources. For many municipalities, this has happened in the first 5 years just after the war ended in 1995. And so, which means that international forms of authority, international governance there, which, because Bosnia is still semi-protectorate, a colony in the midst of Europe, they were engaged in a kind of Janus-faced politics. On one hand, the story about democratization, but on the other hand, the story of privatization, which was absolutely brutal. So for many decades, the key issues in public arena in Bosnia and Herzegovina have been like Dayton Peace Accords, these security issues, etc. So identity, genocide. So you would just hear in the news like Dayton, genocide, massacre here, that trial. Is anyone attempting Dayton reform? Is it implemented or not? Really kind of like empty political talk and pseudo activity, which was actually hiding the real truth of social antagonisms in Bosnia and Herzegovina at that time. So with the whole deterioration of economy, because of the crisis which also hit Bosnia since 2008, 9 and 10, poverty and unemployment have been increasing drastically. And poverty in Bosnia and Herzegovina, which is now the poorest country in Europe, regardless of all this money squandered by the international community. The unemployment is around 50%, and unemployment for young people is between 70 and 80%. So really, horrific things. And it's interesting how in the years between 2010 and 14, when you had like the quickest spiral downwards in terms of these numbers, nobody was mentioning these things. Again, it was just about identity politics, about tabulating and indexing the losses, etc. And playing into the hands of ethno-nationalist and neoliberal marriage that we have in the region, which we actually call all the time ethno-capitalism. There was silence. I mean, at least obvious silence. Well, that's what you could see until 2014, when kind of things exploded, and there was something called the Bosnian Spring, or the February protests in plenums, when the government buildings were burnt down, and then the various plenums were formed around the country that tried to exercise some kind of direct democracy and make demands on the government, etc. So, and here you have a real multitude of various actors in this period, the spring of 2014. So you had various ideological factions there, and also various segments of population, from pensioners to students, unemployed, employed, demobilized soldiers, survivors of wartime sexual violence, teachers, etc. Really, plenums were representative of the whole heterogeneous character of society. And what I want to actually talk about, now giving kind of explanation of this context, I want to talk about the lessons of these protests, and a particular case, actually the center of this protest, and that was the situation with the Dita factory. So when the protests actually happened, that was because a group of workers from different factories in Tuzla has been protesting for many years and months against this corrupt and privatization of their factories, and they've been completely ignored. Then in February, there was police brutality against them when they protested in front of the government building, and because of this police brutality, many more people joined them. In the end, it kind of resulted in this arson, well, burning down, but not only in Tuzla, but it spread throughout Bosnia and Herzegovina. But Dita factory was the most articulate and the most important part of this workers' voice. And for the first time, you could actually hear an articulate and very militant voice of workers saying, you know, what has been done to the industry in Bosnia and Herzegovina, which has been stripped of assets and completely ruined, actually much more in the post-war period than during the war itself. Okay, sorry. I'll go back. So I'll go back to solidarity after I explain a few things about Dita. So in October 2012, the workers of the Dita detergent factory in Tuzla, Bosnia and Herzegovina, erected barricades in front of their factory to prevent the asset stripping and closure of the production plant, as demanded by the ongoing privatization of Dita. And their move was new and unprecedented. All the other factories surrounding Dita, once comprising a huge industrial complex, had already been stripped of assets and closed down. So Dita stood amidst a bare landscape of a few scattered remnants of factories. So Dita workers, hardened and exhausted by years of industrial action, were determined to prevent the dissolution of the factory, which they referred to as home. So their industrial actions concerned the pursuit of justice in the context of violent privatization that was leading them towards destitution. Their claims had included seeking to prosecute those involved in the corrupt privatization of their factory and pursuing their claim for 44 unpaid monthly salaries and other remunerations that were owed to them. And this is a classic example that, I mean, workers just work because they expect at some point they will be paid or their benefits will be paid, but they're not paid for, you know, for years on end. So the unshakable demand insistently poses the question, to whom does the factory belong? This is a larger question about something that was public good and was taken away and actually was not only made, not productive according to some criteria of capitalist efficiency, but it was like completely destroyed, a living wasteland in an already landscape that's marked by this waste of not only human life, but energies, labor, etc. So the organization of the factory occupation took the form of the 1992-1995 wartime defense. A base camp was set up in front of the factory and a 24-hour guard duty was put in place. The breakthrough in this workers' occupation was in how it was conceived and organized. They were not on strike in order to stop production, but were in protest for production. So to be in protest for production was a genuinely new political intervention in post-war Bosnia and Herzegovina, where violent privatization manifests itself in the amassing of wealth by oligarchs at the expense of workers' rights. So from 2000 until the onset of the Dita occupation in this country, many protests against violent privatization, factory closures, and the corrupt judiciary have demanded that the law and the human rights of workers be respected. However, in these earlier protests, the workers had merely undermined and sabotaged themselves by expecting the political elites to protect and defend their rights. Through their occupation, Dita workers claimed and took ownership of their fight for justice. So this is justice which cannot be bought off, bankrupted, privatized, and it is not subject to contractuality. So they affirmed it as the unbribability of the infrastructure of life itself in the context of a dominant governance which is seeking to rule through poverty, through trauma and destitution. And this notion of contractuality is important for me to bring in relation to solidarity, because we have to think about solidarity as a relation but it must not be a contractual relation. And because we are, living capitalism, and we are all, internalizing various forms of alienation, it is very hard to actually see ourselves as how we are tied to society without falling into this logic of the contract. Whereas for social movements and solidarity, emotions and affects are important, passions and love and care is not a contractual relation. So, as authentic care, if we look at reproductive labor. So, in their occupation of the factory, the Dita workers decolonized the factory and took control of the means of production. This act of reclaiming was subsequently affirmed and upheld during the popular protests and plenums in February 2014. So, maybe it is interesting to explore that example of the protest for production and how it inspired this amazing solidarity of the whole of Bosnia and Herzegovina with Dita factory and with these workers on a scale not seen since the end of the war. And how, people were voicing, yes, that the factories are ours. And this is, of course, very, very dangerous, because this is a kind of solidarity about an issue that directly intervenes into property relations. And once you intervene into property relations, then see the brutal, the brutal face of power. Talk about rights and redistribution and this, yes, kind of obsessed. But when you actually say the property relations are based on war and genocide, in this case, it becomes hugely problematic, both for international and local elites, which are in cahoots in any case. This is, the situation, economic situation in Bosnia is caused by IMF, World Bank, various, banks, EU, etc., as well as the local levels of government. They're all equally responsible for such economic situation and political ones. So maybe this protest for production should be understood as a particular type of politically productive solidarity, and this means that in a way, maybe I would like you maybe not to quote me on this, CUNY, but I will say it, I'm just kidding. I will say maybe what we need to recuperate and uphold is the right to violence in the refusal to accept and inhabit the world where the currently dominant ethno-capitalist organization of life is presented as the only possibility. So, the occupation by the Dita workers cut through the dominant property relations. So in following this refusal, maybe we should think about intervening into the trinity of culture, economy, politics by fiercely and violently reclaiming and protecting an undrivable infrastructure which is socially owned. Our life, basically, our social lives. And in the ways in which we come together also when we protest and come together. So only in this way that we actually, I think, at least in Bosnia and Herzegovina, stand some chance to undo the dominant governance through trauma and poverty, and maybe we have some chance to decolonize space and infrastructure in order to claim justice, at least a little bit, so it's not completely dark. But I will move to the question of infrastructure in a wider sense of infrastructure, and also claim that solidarity is infrastructure, an effective or relational infrastructure, and so forth. So, because what this crisis in Bosnia and Herzegovina and elsewhere in the world, this ethno-nationalist or ethno-capitalist government has done, it's also depleted our capacities to think and act politically, to organize our lives so we can think and act politically, to occupy, to plunder our capacities, to master the political time, not just space, but to find time to resist. Such huge emotional energies are happening during any kind of community organizing, that you need a lot of time also to recuperate. And most importantly, there is the issue of trust, which is always under threat in social movements. Trust is the first victim, the first target of fragmentation inside social movement, caused by both external pressures, but also internal ones, if there is any difference. So, okay. So what does it mean to traverse and transform the contingency of imposed privatization to constitute and embody a new genealogy through authentic political intervention in political relations, in order to claim what is ours, to claim the commons, to demand and administer justice by awarding everyone their dues? So before we bear across this difficult terrain, let us note that the old Latin term ius, one of the etymons of the word justice, probably had the following literal meaning: sacred formula. So these ritual formulas for healing the injuries of the privatization and destruction of the commons can be traced deep down in what Moten and Harney have proposed to be the undercommons, which not only shadow and underwrite the common, but make it possible in the first place. So there is a very interesting theorization of undercommons and commons and infrastructure by Angela Mitropoulos in her book in Contract and Contagion, and she has claimed that the undercommons are but a name for what she defines as the infrastructure. Infrastructure, after all, is about how worlds are made, how forms of life are sustained and made viable. To think of politics as infrastructural is to set aside questions of subjectivity, identity, demands, promises, rights, and contracts, and instead to render visible the presumptions that the knots of attachment, adherence, care, or fondness have already tied by nature or supposedly incontestable forms of connection, by kinship, race, money, sexuality, nation, and so on. So the materialities of infrastructure render it the most pertinent political question there is. Everything else is destruction. Infrastructure is the undercommons, neither the skilled virtuosity of the artisan, nor regal damask, nor the jacquard loom that replaced, reproduced, and democratized them, but the weave, how we weave, the method of our work. How do we come together? How do we work together? How do we unite the means of production, producing protest? So how do we communify our infrastructures and struggling against injustice and violence today? I think I should stop here. I think my time is gone, so I can talk about my. Thank you.
Hello. Buenas tardes.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Primero que nada, muchas gracias por darnos la oportunidad de presentar junto con la gente que viene de otros países.
Before anything else, I just want to take the opportunity to thank you all for the opportunity to present alongside people who come from different countries.
Es una bonita oportunidad de poder aprender sobre lo que sucede en Sudamérica, lo que sucede en Centroamérica, lo que sucede en varias partes del mundo.
It's a beautiful chance to get to know and understand what's happening in South America, in Central America and in other parts of the world.
Mi nombre es Oscar Otzoy, miembro de la Coalición de Trabajadores de Immokalee.
My name is Oscar Otzoy, and I am a member of the Coalition of Immokalee Workers.
Y yo no sé qué título ponerme, no sé si activista. Básicamente yo soy un trabajador agrícola de los campos de Guatemala, originario de Guatemala, y de los campos también de la Florida.
And I don't know what title to give myself, maybe an activist, but I think I'll go with worker, an agricultural worker, farm worker from the fields of Guatemala and now in the fields of Florida.
Entonces todavía no he definido exactamente qué es el título que ponerme, porque obviamente soy un trabajador, pero debido a al sistema en que estamos involucrados todos, me ha hecho que hoy en día esté practicando lo que es el activismo diariamente en los campos, en la vida real que uno comparte.
So perhaps I haven't figured out what title to give myself exactly, because at the heart of it, I am a worker who has found himself, because of the systems and the structures that we inhabit and in which we find ourselves, that I am daily practicing activism to confront those structures and to change conditions.
Entonces, más que nada es debido a las condiciones en que estamos involucrados. Yo ahora practico lo que es el activismo en una manera de donde hablamos sobre la realidad que muchos de nosotros enfrentamos después de que la represión del gobierno, después de las represiones de las grandes corporaciones, quienes han creado pobrezas en nuestras comunidades y que nos han hecho que nosotros como trabajadores tenemos que emigrar a otros países en busca de una mejor vida.
So it is due to this activism that I speak, and that comes from coming from conditions in which we faced repression from the government, in which we faced various economic pressures that essentially forced us out of our homes and have led us to come from our countries to face various kinds of oppressions here in this country.
Entonces, hablando un poquito más del contexto de lo que es la Coalición de Trabajadores de Immokalee, es una organización formada en la Florida por parte de trabajadores que vienen de Centroamérica, México y Haití.
So now I'll speak a little bit about the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, which is a farm worker human rights organization that was composed of and continues to be composed of people who come from Guatemala, from Mexico, from other Central American countries, and from Haiti.
Entonces nosotros trabajamos en compañías grandes que producen lo que son los tomates, diferentes tipos de vegetales, incluyendo lo que es la naranja.
And we are workers who harvest tomatoes, who harvest other vegetables, including oranges, on large industrial farms.
Y básicamente la historia de la industria agrícola en este país siempre ha sido escrito con letras grandes en una manera de explotación.
And basically, the history of agriculture in this country has been written with exploitation in big letters.
Por muchos años han pasado personas de diferentes razas trabajando en la industria donde han enfrentado condiciones de pobreza, con salarios sumamente bajos, condiciones de esclavitud y el problema del acoso sexual, que es básicamente el pan de cada día de cada mujer en los campos.
And throughout the course of history, there have been people of many races and of many peoples who have faced the same conditions in different forms. We have faced exploitation, we have faced sub-poverty wages, we have faced various forms of slavery even, and we have faced sexual harassment and violence, and that today continues to form the bread of every day of farm worker women in the fields.
Bueno, me han pedido hablar sobre el significado de solidaridad.
And today, you all have asked me to speak about the significance of solidarity.
Y lo voy a hacer de la perspectiva del trabajador y también en parte de la perspectiva sobre cómo nosotros trabajamos para crear alianzas o poder implementar el verdadero sentido que tiene la solidaridad.
And I'm going to speak about solidarity in two ways, from the perspective of a farm worker, but also from the perspective of forming alliances, these alliances that we've built over the years to change conditions.
Voy a hacerlo primero de la parte de nuestra comunidad.
So first I'll speak from the perspective of our farm worker community.
Nuestra comunidad, debido a los que venimos de diferentes países, muchos de nosotros somos hablantes de un segundo idioma, o en el caso de muchos de nosotros como los guatemaltecos. Nuestro primer idioma es un idioma que es indígena de nuestra comunidad.
So members of our community come from many different places. And for many of us, Spanish, for example, is our second language. In Guatemala, many of us come from indigenous villages where we speak indigenous languages as our first one.
Lo mismo que es la gente que viene del sur de México. A veces el idioma indígena que hablan ellos es el primero que, en la manera en que ellos son más cómodos comunicándose entre compañeros.
Likewise, people who come from the southern Mexico often speak their indigenous language when they're in the community and feel most comfortable communicating with each other in that language.
Y en eso también tenemos la comunidad haitiana, que en su mayoría habla el criol y algunos hablan el francés.
And we also have the Haitian community, the majority of whom speak Creole, and some of them also speak French.
Entonces, al principio de la organización se hicieron varias maneras de cómo organizar entre las personas provenientes de varios países.
And when our organization first began, what we had to think about was how we were going to connect all of these people who came from different countries and backgrounds.
Creo que en lugar de ver una dificultad de cómo organizar, se vio una manera de buscar una solución de cómo unir estas tres comunidades o estas varias comunidades que hay en nuestra comunidad para poder solidarizarnos los unos a los otros para enfrentar lo que son los problemas que uno enfrenta en el trabajo.
So rather than see those differences as an obstacle, we thought about how we could see them as an opportunity to unify ourselves between peoples in order to build worker power, build solidarity amongst ourselves, to confront the powers that were holding us back.
Aprendimos de que muchos de nosotros tenemos un potencial bastante grande de poder organizar fuera de nuestros países.
We learned that many of us, all of us, have the potential to organize even outside of our own countries.
Aprendimos de que muchos de nosotros traemos en la sangre la manera en cómo organizar con nuestras comunidades y haciéndolo en la comunidad de Immokalee, practicándolo de las maneras de cómo se organizan en Centroamérica o en México.
We learned that it's in our blood to be able to organize and to connect with each other, to take the practices of organizing that we were using in our home countries in Central America and Mexico and apply them to our new community of Immokalee.
Aprendimos a usar los métodos de educación popular para poder transmitir un mensaje hacia la comunidad.
We learned to use popular education methods in order to communicate messages to the broader community.
Usamos, por ejemplo, nosotros como organización, usamos el método de reflexionar mediante un dibujo. O a veces nosotros hacemos teatros, que no somos profesionales en eso, pero la situación nos ha llevado a que nosotros podamos crear ese tipo de teatro para poder hacer que la gente hable de los problemas, comparte sus experiencias y de esa manera hemos podido nosotros parar el robo de salario, el maltrato físico y verbal de parte de los patrones. Hemos podido parar o llevar casos a las cortes donde los compañeros son esclavizados dentro del lugar del trabajo.
These kinds of popular education methods have included using drawings or cartoons that illustrate a condition, and we use it to form reflections and analyses amongst ourselves as a community. We've also used popular theater. We're not professionals, but we have built these theaters out of necessity, out of a way of trying to find how to communicate and how to build an analysis amongst ourselves as a community. And we've used these tools of popular education effectively in order to talk about things like wage theft, things like exploitation in the fields, things like violence. And we've been successful in using them in empowering ourselves, even to bring to court cases of modern-day slavery that fellow farm workers have faced.
Hemos visto de que el idioma o las culturas o la manera en que piensa la gente puede ser diferente, pero cuando lo unimos creamos un poder dentro de la comunidad para poder hacer el cambio.
We've seen that language and cultures may mark us as different peoples, but they can actually be a source of strength if we unify amongst them and use them to derive power to fight back in our community.
Un poquito más de la historia de la coalición, de todo lo que ha hecho.
A little bit more on the history of the coalition and all that it's done.
Hemos hecho una huelga de hambre de 30 días por parte de 6 miembros de la comunidad.
We have done a 30-day hunger strike on the part of 6 farm workers, members of the community.
Hemos hecho marchas del parqueadero que hay en Immokalee, de uno de los parqueaderos o enfrente de la oficina de la coalición hacia las compañías agrícolas, donde la mayoría de la gente trabaja recogiendo los productos.
We have organized work stoppages and marches from the central parking lot of Immokalee, where people go to find work, to the companies, the growers, where a lot of the farm worker community is employed.
Hemos hecho marchas de 234 millas, caminando, buscando un diálogo con los rancheros. Y esto hace varios años, la Asociación de Frutas y Vegetales de la Florida estaba basado en un lugar que se llama Orlando. Este lugar es muy popular por todo lo que hay ahí, pero trabajadores decidieron hacer una marcha de varios días, muchos de ellos dejando de trabajar, muchos de ellos sacrificándose también para poder llevar ese mensaje que es necesario para los rancheros.
Following that, we organized a march of 234 miles based in a town called Orlando, which many of you might know for all of the things that it has to offer, but to us, for farm workers, we marched there in order to challenge the Florida Fruit and Vegetable Association. And it was workers who went off work for 2 weeks who made that sacrifice in order to assert their rights and fight for better conditions.
Muchos de nosotros como trabajadores hemos puesto en práctica nuestra solidaridad dentro de nuestra comunidad.
So this is how we as workers have put to practice solidarity in our own community.
Pero también hemos puesto en práctica esta ecuación que yo les voy a compartir ahora.
We've also put into practice this equation that I'm going to show you all right now.
C más C es igual a C.
C plus C equals C.
¿Alguien sabrá de acá?
Does anyone here know that?
¿No?
No?
Les voy a descifrar esta ecuación algebraica que la comunidad ha hecho.
I'm going to decipher this algebraic equation that this community has made. Someone knows?
Correcto.
Correct. Woo!
Conciencia más compromiso es igual a cambio. Esa es una de las maneras de cómo nosotros creamos mediante las maneras de que nosotros organizamos en la comunidad.
Consciousness plus commitment equals change. This is one of our mentalities, one of the guidelines that we use as we organize in our community.
Y creo que esto también sería la respuesta más sencilla de lo que pudiera uno descifrar o pudiera dar una respuesta a la pregunta grande que se está hablando ahora, ¿qué significa la solidaridad?
And I think it's useful, this deciphering of this equation, when we are thinking about the question that was posed to us today of what is solidarity.
Cuando nosotros empezamos a hablar sobre esto con los trabajadores, los trabajadores asistían bastante a nuestras juntas que hacemos cada miércoles.
We would speak to workers about this in the weekly Wednesday night worker meetings.
Cada miércoles nosotros nos reunimos hablando sobre diferentes temas, incluyendo analizar qué debemos hacer o cómo debemos seguir creando cambios que son necesarios en nuestro lugar de trabajo. Yes.
In these Wednesday night worker meetings, we think about all of the conditions that we face in our workplace and we analyze what's going on.
Pero también lo empezamos a analizar en la manera de cómo nosotros podemos compartir esto con otras comunidades o con otro grupo de personas, por ejemplo, con los estudiantes, por ejemplo, con la gente de fe, por ejemplo, con las personas de otras comunidades también, de cómo pueden aprender sobre nuestra situación, pero cómo pueden tomar acción junto con nosotros.
But something else that we reflect on as a community in those meetings and elsewhere is how do we take our message and our struggle to other communities? How do we take it to students around the country, to people of faith, to consumers, to all sorts of people so that they understand what we're going through and can help support us in our struggle?
Pero más que aprender eso en otras comunidades es cómo la gente qué es lo que la gente debe de hacer para poder crear esos cambios.
And beyond just learning and education, it's what can people do? How can people take action to make these changes possible?
Entonces nosotros como trabajadores, analizando nuestras condiciones y analizando las acciones que hemos hecho contra los rancheros, también analizamos por qué es que la pobreza está centrado en una comunidad de trabajadores agrícolas.
So after a period of our initial organizing, we as workers were thinking, why is it that despite all of the pressure that we have put on the growers, the owners of production of tomatoes, why haven't these changes been made? And where does the power in this industry really reside to make those changes?
Porque nosotros, cuando se hizo la huelga de hambre, cuando se hicieron las marchas, no tuvimos una respuesta positiva de parte de los rancheros.
Because when we were doing that hunger strike and those work stoppages and the march that I mentioned, we never received a positive response from the growers.
Entonces nosotros tuvimos que cambiar también nuestra estrategia de cómo crear presión o cómo crear los cambios.
So what we had to do was change our strategy, is how do we shift the pressure, how do we change where we're focused in order to make change?
Y nosotros vimos de que las corporaciones son directamente los que crean y destruyen las comunidades, crean pobreza y destruyen las comunidades.
And what we found was that it was major food retailer corporations that are the culprits of creating poverty and destroying our communities.
Y como los vegetales es el tema de la comida, es un tema de comida, entonces nosotros nos enfocamos primero en corporaciones de comida rápida.
And because these produce, these vegetables are in the food industry, we started to focus on fast food retailers first.
Pero primero nosotros creamos demandas hacia estas corporaciones.
And in order to do this, we created a set of demands for these corporations.
Dijimos, los salarios son bajos, vamos a pedir 1 centavo más por cada libra de tomate.
We said, these wages are low, well, we're going to ask for a penny more per pound of tomatoes to be paid to workers.
No tenemos protecciones en el trabajo, vamos a decir a las corporaciones que nos ayuden a crear protecciones en el lugar de trabajo.
We don't have protections in our workplace? Well, then we're going to ask these corporations to help us in ensuring that there are protections down the supply chain in our workplace.
No tenemos derechos que son implementados en el trabajo. Vamos a pedir a estas corporaciones que hagan que estos derechos que merecemos como trabajadores sean implementados en el lugar de trabajo.
We don't have rights in the workplace? Well, we're going to ask these corporations to help us to actually implement these rights in the fields.
Entonces nosotros creamos 3 demandas. El centavo más por libra, un código de conducta donde hay 0 tolerancia a la esclavitud, más 0 tolerancia al acoso sexual, y la tercera es la voz del trabajador que esté incluido en decisiones que las corporaciones vayan a tomar.
So our 3 demands were, first, that these corporations pay a penny more per pound of tomatoes to help raise wages for farm workers. Second, that they respect a human rights code of conduct that would have 0 tolerance for forced labor and 0 tolerance for sexual violence. And finally, that the voice of the worker would be respected and that we would have a seat at the table in the implementation of all of this.
Con esas demandas fuimos también hacia los consumidores.
With these demands, we went to consumers.
Explicamos nuestra realidad y les dijimos que aquí hay herramientas que pueden usar para presionar también a las corporaciones.
We said, this is our reality, and here are some of the tools that you can use to join us in pressuring these corporations.
En varias ocasiones nos han preguntado a nosotros sobre por qué no van con el gobierno,
Many times people have asked us, why don't you just go to the government?
por qué no le piden al gobierno a cambiar las legislaciones.
Why don't you ask the government to change legislation?
Cada 4 años, en Estados Unidos cada 4 años o cada 8 años cambian los gobiernos y a veces ya no quieren seguir con los reglamentos que se pusieron.
Every 4 years or every 8 years here in the United States, governments change, and sometimes they don't want to continue the legislation that's already on the books.
Pero el quien no cambia somos nosotros. Somos nosotros los consumidores.
But those who don't change are us, the consumers.
Somos nosotros los que tenemos la última palabra en cada corporación sobre los cambios que deben de hacer.
Right now, we have the last word on pressuring these corporations into doing what they should be doing.
Entonces hemos encontrado al mejor aliado del trabajador. Hemos encontrado la manera de cómo nosotros lidiar con los problemas que ha afectado por décadas la industria agrícola.
So we have found the best allies for workers. And in this way, we have found how to actually transform the industry to end oppressions that have affected workers for decades.
Pero también hemos encontrado la manera de expandir nuestro entendimiento sobre lo que es el tema de solidaridad.
But we've also found a way for us to expand our understanding of solidarity.
Y creo que es importante para todos conocer y saber de que las injusticias en este país aún siguen pasando.
And I think it's important for everybody to know that injustices in this country continue to take place.
Tenemos este problema los trabajadores que hemos enfrentado, pero también hemos logrado traer a 14 corporaciones que son parte de la solución en el trabajo.
We continue to face problems, but what we have done thus far is to bring 14 corporate food retailers to the table with us in order to change conditions in the agricultural industry.
Lo hemos visto ahora con todas nuestras campañas que hemos venido haciendo.
This has been a direct result of the campaigns that we have led for the past, I'll add, 18 years.
El ejemplo más claro de la implementación de esto, no solo de trabajadores, sino de aliados, es el pasado mes. En marzo, aquí en la ciudad de Nueva York tuvimos un ayuno de 5 días.
And the clear representation of this equation, not just amongst us as workers, but also between workers and consumer allies, is what happened last month here in New York City. a freedom fast that took place over the course of 5 days.
En alguna ocasión tal vez han visto o han escuchado de la campaña que tenemos como boicoteando a las corporaciones.
You may have already heard of campaigns where we boycott corporations.
Yo sé que nadie de los paneles que hemos tenido, que hemos escuchado, ha llamado a hacer acción en esta conferencia.
I haven't really heard anyone else in this conference talk about an action that people can take in this conference.
Pero yo quiero hacerlo,
But I want to do it.
porque yo creo que la solidaridad se tiene que mostrar desde el momento que uno aprende de las condiciones en que enfrentan los trabajadores o de las condiciones en que viven las comunidades.
But I want to do it because I think that solidarity needs to start from the very moment in which you hear of the conditions that workers face or the exploitation that communities face.
Entonces, antes de que se vayan, por favor, allá en la entrada tenemos estos postales que ustedes lo pueden llevar y entregar en el Wendy's que está en la vuelta de la esquina.
So before you all leave, I want you all to take one of these Boycott Wendy's postcards that are on the table right outside, and you all can go and deliver it to the Wendy's that's just on the corner down Fifth Avenue.
Esta es la mejor manera de poner en práctica la solidaridad.
This is really the best way to put into practice solidarity.
Y creo que hablando un poquito más sobre lo que nosotros hemos alcanzado por medio de nuestro programa es también la expansión de nuestro programa a otros estados.
And so I'll end by talking about what we have accomplished with the Fair Food Program and now the expansion of the Fair Food Program to different states.
Por ejemplo, lo están ahorita implementando en Vermont trabajadores de las lecherías.
Now, for example, dairy workers in Vermont are implementing the Fair Food Program's model in their own industry.
Nosotros mismos, con la ayuda de las 14 corporaciones, hemos estado implementando este programa donde vamos a diferentes otros estados, 6 estados que estamos siguiendo, a educar a los trabajadores acerca de sus derechos.
Now that we are collaborating with these 14 corporations, we are taking the Fair Food Program into 6 other states beyond Florida and educating workers about the rights that they now have under the Code of Conduct.
Creo que aparte de tener las 14 corporaciones, tenemos también al 90% de los rancheros de la Florida de acuerdos para poder implementar el programa por comida justa.
As a result of our struggle, we not only have the participation of these 14 corporate food retailers, but we also have the participation of 90% of Florida's tomato growers, the 3 parties of which are collaborating in order to implement the Fair Food Program throughout this tomato industry.
Traigo el ejemplo de por qué nuestros folletos son en español, en inglés, y se me olvidó traer el de criol.
These Fair Food Program Know Your Rights booklets are in Spanish, in English, and I forgot to bring the one in Creole.
Pero aquí está la muestra de cómo nosotros implementamos un programa de responsabilidad social dirigido por trabajadores.
This is the evidence of what we are doing now, which is implementing a social responsibility program that is driven and led by farm workers.
Sabemos bien de que las corporaciones siempre van a tratar de cubrir o de guardar bastante lo que es su imagen o la marca que ellos tienen.
We know that corporations will often try to hide or paper over the abuses that are behind the brands that they have.
Y las corporaciones también tienen su código de conducta escrito,
And corporations often have their codes of conduct written down,
que es la responsabilidad social corporativa.
that's corporate social responsibility.
Nosotros en respuesta a eso, creamos la responsabilidad social dirigida por trabajadores.
And in response to that, what we've created is worker-driven social responsibility.
Este modelo es nuevo.
This is a new model.
Este modelo se está comenzando a expandir en otros estados también.
This is the model that's starting to expand into other states.
Pero este es el modelo de un programa que ha sido creado por trabajadores inmigrantes.
But this is a model of a program that has been created by migrant farm workers.
Trabajadores inmigrantes quienes hemos sido desplazados de nuestras comunidades.
Farm workers who are immigrants and who have been displaced from their communities.
Y yo creo que, como yo siempre lo he mencionado, es que este país y la gente de este país debe de sentir orgullo por la gente que ha venido a crear este tipo de programas.
And as I've always said, I think that the people of this country should be proud of those of us who have come and who have built initiatives like this one.
A veces a nosotros nos ven cuando ven a trabajadores con playeras o camisas sucias, uno como los hace a un lado o piensa que no tienen ningún valor aquí.
Sometimes you will see a worker who has a dirty shirt on from coming in the fields, and you merely pass them by, not thinking that they really have any value being here.
Pero estas personas tienen bastantes ideas y buenas en que implementar.
But these people have lots of ideas and lots of good ideas that are worth implementing.
Por último, quiero nomás mencionar de que nuestro programa también está siendo usado como modelo en Bangladesh por el problema que pasó allá en el 2013 cuando cayó el edificio y murieron varias personas. Entonces, es un modelo de responsabilidad social dirigida por trabajadores en donde se está haciendo todo lo posible para poder cambiar desde el lugar de nuestro trabajo hasta el lugar del trabajo de otras personas.
And lastly, I want to say that the Fair Food Program's model of worker-driven social responsibility is now being adopted by workers in Bangladesh. We've been collaborating with unions that have been responding to the tragedy that happened in 2013 when the Rana Plaza building caught fire and killed over 1,000 workers inside the building. We have been working in order to ensure that workers' voices are heard and that we're able to ensure responsibility throughout the supply chain.
Y eso es nuestro trabajo que hemos hecho por cerca de 25 años.
This is the product of the work that we've done for over 25 years.
Son las maneras de cómo hemos juntado las comunidades y las religiones también a unirse y buscar justicia para trabajadores.
This is the story of how we've been able to unite workers, how we've been able to unite religions even, all to further the end of justice for farm workers.
Y es bonito ver cómo compartir la solidaridad entre los grupos de personas.
And it's beautiful to see how we can share in solidarity amongst different groups of people.
En una de nuestras marchas hemos tenido la experiencia que hemos vivido, es tener a un pastor, una pastora, a un anarquista y todo tipo de personas estar marchando con nosotros.
And the experiences we've had at marches are to have a reverend, another reverend who's female, and an anarchist and workers all marching together for the same issue.
Todos con diferentes ideologías, pero cuando se habla del sistema de comida, todos estamos involucrados.
All with different ideologies, but when it comes to the food system, we are all implicated.
Entonces, muchas gracias por el tiempo que nos dan. Es emocionante poder compartir y poder hablar sobre el trabajo de la coalición que a mí aún me sigue inspirando bastante en lo que hacemos.
So many thanks for the time that you all have given me. It is a privilege to share the work of the coalition that to this day continues to inspire me to work and to seek justice.
Y esa misma inspiración yo quiero que lo tengan también para que puedan compartir lo que nosotros hacemos aquí, al igual que lo que hacen los otros grupos en otros países y ver cómo podemos expandir más nuestro entendimiento sobre lo que es solidaridad en las comunidades.
So I hope you'll take this inspiration too to get involved and to continue talking amongst ourselves of how to connect across peoples, across countries, and deepen our understanding of solidarity.
Thank you.
Gracias, Oscar. We have a few minutes for discussion. I think it would do violence to the presentations to try and lump them all together and say they say the same thing about solidarity. I do know that we now have at least two formula for solidarity. C plus C equals C, and communify, not commodify, which I take from Jasmina's paper. Now, those aren't necessarily compatible. I should warn the participants that as of now, we won't be eating at Wendy's for dinner. But anyway, I do have a couple of questions. And actually, perhaps we could start with Sagan and Robyn. Again, two different approaches to the sort of history of solidarity, but I was particularly struck by both the possibilities that you draw out by using sort of lessons of solidarity from the past, and also a sort of countervailing possibility that some of those forms of solidarity may actually be historically foreclosed now, that the specific conditions of that solidarity are no longer active, at least in the way we perceive them. Would either of you like, or perhaps both of you could speak to that?
Definitely. I think when we see Sekou Odinga talk to us about the Panthers having an embassy in another country and the possibilities of spaces and places around the world of relative freedom from the tentacles of U.S. involvement, those spaces and places are oftentimes foreclosed now. In fact, the Panthers would leave Algeria after the government began to put pressure on them in response to pressure from the United States. And even when we think about someone like Assata Shakur in Cuba today and the struggles around maintaining her very fragile liberation and hard-fought for liberation, you can definitely kind of see how the different realities on the ground have shifted what has been possible. On the other hand, I feel like there are, in ways, more possibilities than were ever possible before. Like, just thinking about the potentials of connectivity around social media, I think the possibilities of transversing barriers of language through technology and other things are there in ways that were not there before. I can decide to become involved in struggles, in supporting struggles that I may not have known about. I can follow people on Twitter. I can, deal with language through these translations. However, it's the on-the-ground possibility, the very real kind of connective tissue that remains fragile, I believe. It feels like we have access to more and more information, more and more ways to connect, but yet we feel disconnected, right? We can peek in on different moments and places, but how is that peeking in translating into very real solidarity? How do we understand what people are really going through on the ground in the way in which social media itself is a mediated and surveilled space, as we have learned even more in the last weeks? So how do we sort of transverse that? I think there are new possibilities and also new challenges in this moment.
Yeah, I would add that to what Robyn already said about these possibilities. Also, the interesting question, I think, is this: what do we learn from these defeats of solidarity? It's not just the successes or like opening up the possibilities, but also these types of the solutions and the conditions, and then whether these experiences of loss or defeat or tragedy, if you will, is still with us or not, and or articulates itself in different ways and forms. This, this emergence of divisions and or difference, when difference becomes a form of subordination or a domination. It's not just a difference that comes together in common struggle and take it further, but difference that becomes like a basic dividing factor, or like creating this type of negative antagonism rather than this positive one, if you will. In terms of this question of international solidarity, actually, which came up earlier panels too, this is the possibility of, if you will, like inventing forms of internationalist practices of solidarity. I think like there is a certain legacy. We are at the same time not completely in the dark. International, the first international, the second, third, fourth, and with the Jasmina also talked about that, these articulations of different forms of violence together, like the war, class war, but also like the foreign war or genocide war or this mass state violence together. They operate together, repression and the capitalist transformations. And this is also the crux of the international. Like its emergence is so much based on not only class war, but also the foreign war. The foreign wars, like the German, Franco-German war, or the defeat of the Paris Commune, or like the Second International, Rosa Luxemburg's, and Lenin's critique of the Second International, the peace politics is being kind of a nationalistic too, or the class war contained in the national framework, and so on and so forth. So this actual question of war, repression, military repressions, and class struggle, if you will, has been there in this internationalist imaginary, and I think like this is there is certainly like a memory or that comes from the history and memory, and that will I think like it's open to regeneration of certain forms, but also with I just said one more sentence and end there too, but also that solidarity is a kind of a tricky term, like in social science, the requirement solidarity is used for conservative purposes, like is more about the cohesion and national cohesion and status quo, the ordering, and also the solidarity that is used in different forms, like this, humanitarian solidarity understanding, so turning into a kind of professional, institutionalized practice of giving. The sovereign subject gives to the victim and the needy, this type of charity-based politics, which does not really generate so much of life, but sometimes, often, also reproduces hierarchies on a different end, perhaps. So this becomes this dominant kind of a form. Maybe in that sense, how they would articulate together these competing internationalist imaginaries, or whether one displaces the other seems to be the question, and which will be in practice, I think, like depending on this particular mobilization, will be kind of important to respond to that.
Yeah, that's actually another topic, I think, for the breakout sessions tomorrow, where we can elaborate on precisely those developments or sort of counterfactual arguments almost. Jasmina, I was struck not simply by the invocation of violence in the presentation, but on the flip side of that, the question of affect and care. And I agree with you that in terms of privatization and property relations, there's an act of violence that's imminent to that moment. But could you say a little bit more how care and affect work in this the solidarity you're proposing?
Thank you for this questions. Yes, maybe we can, as a good friend of mine, Nina Power, would say, maybe we should weaponize care. So what to do with that?
I'm writing all of this down.
How to weaponize. In terms of this politics of affect in social movements around these strong concerns like care or infrastructure necessary for care, because we are talking about a particular form of reproductive labor, because we reproduce ourselves as friends and activists in social movements all the time. We somehow bring back energies by reflecting, by sharing, etc. Otherwise, the pressures are sometimes so hard that it would be very hard to withstand them. And I'm talking really here when you're surrounded by the politics of terror, like in Turkey. If you say something at a university, being a professor, you have immediate brutal force directed at you. We had the same in Bosnia. We had police side of faculties, asking professors what you're doing, and in the protests, etc. So you actually live in a very acute situation of fear. Why, maybe, I did say that we have to preserve that right, because I lived through the war, and I know the importance of self-defense. You do have the right to defend yourself.
Sure. Sure.
Well, in some forms. So I'm just saying that when brutal exploitation happens, and you exhausted all the avenues of actually changing something, it is quite understandable that at least violence is, sometimes can be really productive in completely changing the debate, like this violence that happened, and changing the political landscape. Violence that happened in 2014. Since then, the news are all the time just about unemployment and poverty and no longer just about identity and data. And so I think there's been a huge shift. On the other hand, the social movement, the nascent social movement, has been crushed after that by the coordinated, reorganized regimes of power, both international and national. So they've changed the laws on public protest and how you can protest. They've trained the army and the police together how to contain civil protests. At the same time, they've been hiding, they've been veiling this up, masking this, like saying, oh, we're doing the contract on growth and employment, some new EU measure for Bosnia, which actually came out to nothing because it was just empty neoliberal talk. So, also, they vetoed or blacklisted all the organizations or activists which were involved in these protests, which were saying not only death to nationalism, but also death to capitalism. This is a very so maybe they would somehow even get over this death to nationalism, but death to capitalism, I think, was too big a threat to let go so easily. But how they really fragmented and crumbled the movement from inside is precisely because usually the external pressures turn out, get transformed into horizontal hostility and mistrust. And in terms of effective labor that's needed to counter that, I think we have to be maybe thinking about that. Well, we've been thinking about that a lot more in Bosnia and talking about it. So there was this complete crumbling of social movement for a year. Everybody was fighting everybody. Everybody was terribly disappointed. So how do we deal with, when we fail? What do we do with failure? Is it like fail again, fail better? So, but it's important, especially when it comes to young people, because political struggle is about persistence and duration, and that's why I was talking also about time. So how do we prepare ourselves? This is not something that's going to be sorted out in a year or 6 months. We are maybe going to have some incremental things, but just kind of, and yet again, something might happen in a year that can change things drastically, as has been done, as has been proven many times in history. So I'm actually concerned about how do we keep these energies to think and act and come together politically, because I think that it's very hard emotionally for us to communify, because we are sometimes reluctant to reflect on emotional aspects of our alienation, how it has affected the way we relate to the world, how we are ourselves brutalized by neoliberalism as human beings. Even when we are activists, we can still be,
Okay.
it's a constant struggle. So it's not only about transformation, but also self-transformation.
I wanted to ask a quick question too of Oscar. The tactics that you elucidated certainly bring out some compromises from the major corporations, right? I was wondering whether the corporations are also more slippery, and so that their answer to, say, an increase in wages locally means the transmigration of their corporation globally, that they'll actually shift production elsewhere and take advantage of lower prices in a different market.
Gracias por su pregunta.
Thanks for your question.
Y creo que eso me hace también pensar un poquito sobre la campaña actual en la que estamos, pero también como ver un poquito sobre las diferentes otras corporaciones quienes se han comprometido a implementar y a comprar los productos de donde los derechos de los trabajadores se están implementando.
So your question makes me think of two things. First, the current campaign in which we're engaged with Wendy's. And second, what the agreements in which these corporations have entered consist in, where they commit to purchasing Florida tomatoes exclusively from farms that participate in the Fair Food Program and protect farm worker human rights.
Y quiero mencionar de que el 90% de los productos o los vegetales que es consumido durante el tiempo de invierno en estos estados proviene de la Florida.
I want to mention that 90% of fresh tomatoes that are consumed in this country between the winter months of October through May come from the state of Florida.
Y esto pasa porque aquí está nevando y en la Florida tenemos un clima bastante agradable.
That happens because it's snowing here in the winter while we in Florida have nice weather.
Estas corporaciones que han firmado el acuerdo están haciendo su compra en la Florida y están haciendo que estos acuerdos se estén implementando de la manera que se ha escrito con todas las corporaciones.
So these corporations, the 14 corporations that have committed to the Fair Food Program, are purchasing their Florida tomatoes according to the legally binding agreements that we have signed with them to improve the conditions in the fields of Florida.
Y estamos seguros de que varias de las corporaciones quienes son parte del programa también hacen compra hacia México, por ejemplo, donde las condiciones de los trabajadores están más tristes allá.
And we know that many of these corporations must also purchase from Mexico, where the conditions for workers are sadder, they are worse.
Pero también, por ejemplo, el tema de la globalización o el tema de la inmigración. Si entramos en ese tema, estamos extendiendo un poquito más sobre lo que el entendimiento. Porque muchas veces uno piensa, ¿por qué tanta gente está inmigrando a este país? Pero cuando vemos sobre el papel que están haciendo las corporaciones también, de poder mover sus compras hacia allá. En el caso de Wendy's, ellos lo han dicho públicamente, que ellos compran sus productos en México y no compran sus productos en donde el programa se está implementando.
So in this question, we are seeing the themes of globalization, of global migration, that impacts both how workers move from country to country and end up here, for example, harvesting. If we go down that path, we're going to cover many themes, but I'll keep it to that phenomenon, as well as the phenomenon of corporations that can also shift purchasing internationally or globally. And that's exactly what we've seen in the case of Wendy's, which after we launched our campaign with them, actually came out publicly saying that they shifted their purchases away from participating farms in Florida to Mexico in response to our campaign.
Entonces nosotros estamos haciendo lo posible de explicar a la gente de Wendy's de la importancia de apoyar los productos locales.
So we are doing what's possible in order to pressure Wendy's to support this Florida production under the Fair Food Program.
Incluyendo eso, también estamos trabajando con varias otras organizaciones a nivel nacional como a nivel internacional para poder implementar este programa y poder hacer que los derechos de los trabajadores en cualquier país puedan ser respetados y puedan también que las corporaciones quienes compren allá puedan ayudar a que esos trabajadores tengan una voz dentro del trabajo si tienen algún problema laboral.
And at the same time, we're seeing how we can collaborate and work with different worker organizations, different entities in order to ensure that workers' rights are protected, not just in the Florida tomato industry and in the 6 states that's covered by the Fair Food Program, but also in other states, in other countries, in other industries.
Y creo que es bueno poder conectarnos como grupos, como organizaciones y poder, no importa dónde estemos, poder mostrar la solidaridad entre cada uno, de cómo podemos cambiar esas tácticas que tienen las corporaciones de comprar en otros países y de cómo hacer que estas corporaciones también sean responsables cuando los derechos de los trabajadores son violados en el lugar de trabajo.
And I think that's why it's important for us to come together and to learn from one another, to come to support one another, so that we can hold these corporations accountable for those actions that they take when they shift purchases from place to place and end up perpetuating the exploitation of workers worldwide.
Thank you very much for that answer. We are out of time for this particular panel, so I wanted to thank our participants again and our translator for help. While we shift seats, I wanted to go to the podium and do a few thank yous before our keynote this evening. Thanks, guys. Yes, this one works too. Before everybody leaves, just leave the table, don't leave the room. As has been mentioned earlier, a conference of this kind takes a lot of work, a lot of hours, And as I did earlier in the day, I thank all the participants for taking the time and the energy to come to the conference today, and I hope participate in what we do tomorrow. And I also thank the audience too. It's a little bit grueling, right? Without not much in the way of calories between midday and now. As our program notes, however, there are particular individuals who have worked hard to put this conference together, and I want them to be recognized now. First is our Assistant Director, Mary Taylor, over here. Mary. Is Malav here? Malav Kanuga? No. Oh, okay. He's at another conference. Well, then I won't thank him. No. Mamira Duge Prosper. Who we've actually purloined sort of from Iridac, which is another research unit at the Graduate Center focused on the African diaspora and the Caribbean. But I can testify that Mamira has worked as hard for us as she's worked for them. Rob Robinson. Mesa Mendonça. Is Ezra here? Ezra Padgett? No? Okay. Also, Erica Sarusi for the poster design. Kevin Kaplicki for the print editions. And once again, all the members of the Caracol Language Cooperative for their translation and interpretations today. Now, last but not least, that leaves Sonia Vaz-Borges here. I put her last because she's standing right next to me. And her work actually is not finished because she's going to introduce our keynote, Corsino Tolentino, this evening. But I would say that Sonia is our postdoc at the Center for Place, Culture, and Politics. And this is further evidence of her untiring ability to devote long hours to what we do. So thank you very much. And now, without further ado, the floor is yours.
Please don't leave. Good evening. Thank you very much for your presence. I will introduce you our next speaker, the keynote, Corsino Tolentino. Corsino Tolentino, born Andrea Corsino Tolentino, has a PhD in comparative education on university and social transformation in Cape Verde, which is a research that was considered foundational for the creation and development of University of Cape Verde. Tolentino was born in Cape Verde, in the island of Sant Antão, in 1946, and attended school in Cape Verde, Portugal, and internationally too, like in countries like Belgium, Russia, and also the United States. He was a freedom fighter under the Amílcar Cabral PAIGC liberation struggle. PAIGC stands for African Party for Independence of Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde. After independence, he was the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs of Cape Verde, and member of the Parliament, and ambassador to Portugal, Spain, France, and Italy between 81 and 84. He was also Minister of Education in Cape Verde between 1984 and 1991, and he worked with UNESCO and the World Bank as a consultant. And he was also director of the Gulbenkian Foundation between 2000 and 2006. He also launched the West African Institute and the Academy of Science of Cape Verde. He researches, teaches, and writes on politics, education, and migration. Tolentino is also the author of the book Cabo Verde, Janelas de África, which means Cape Verde Islands, Windows of Africa, from 2006. And he recently wrote a brief essay about the Aristides Maria Pereira, which was the first president of Cape Verde. It's a pleasure to be here on this table with you.
Thank you very much. My vocal cords are a misery, but anyway, I will try, because with this presentation, I am compromised to do the best. First of all, I would like to thank to all the panelists with whom I learned a lot long time ago about what I had needed to learn before. I making a reflection about this insurgent solidarity. Each of you presented a reflection very specific, and I think maybe we will try to put them together and find an issue. But many thanks to this center, whose direction invited us, Elena and me, and many people who participate in this meeting. How did my country and I grow up together during nearly 43 years? That was possible because I am a fortunate islander. Let me explain a bit this. I was born in one of the 9 inhabited pieces that form the archipelago of Cape Verde. In 1970, I fully joined the PAIGC insurgent movement, meaning the African Party for the Independence of Guinea and Cape Verde Islands. The former is located in the African continent, and the latter is in deep Atlantic Ocean, very far away. In actuality, I had joined the organization before 1970, while completing my secondary education and university studies. I simultaneously mobilized Cape Verdean and Guineans to join the national liberation struggle in countries with a strong tradition of receiving them as immigrants. They don't want anymore. The goal was to replace the colonial order with national freedom of choice in both territories. PAIGC's mission was a great challenge and still remains. The following dates may provide some context of events. In 1960, long time ago, the world heard about the leader Amílcar Cabral, who was killed in Amílcar Cabral and the fight taking place in Portuguese colonies. In 1973, the leader was killed in strange circumstances, and Guinea-Bissau was recognized as a sovereign state by dozens of countries. In 1980, a military coup in Bissau resulted in splitting of the insurgent movement into national and weaker branches in 1981. The situation is still the same. Two autonomous countries, two autonomous parties into independent states. Originated from the PAIGC. Maybe you learned about this. The armed struggle never started in the island of Cape Verde because we had a principle, a value which was unity and struggle, and as permanent values, and the complexity of our international relations. In my view, action and luck brought about the events of April 25th, 1974 in Portugal, a political coup born in Guinea-Bissau. Negotiation replaced of July 1975. My deep involvement in the preceding events explains why I say that my country and I interacted for at least 4 decades. I'm old, as you know. I'm not allowed to regret it, although our island have since made progress. Unfortunately for me, it has not been toward equality. At that time, I thought that we would. The evolution has been in the opposite direction. Yes, some people have been left far behind, which signifies two things at least. First, the social difference are a sort of insurgents' collective debt to the people. And second, we have to play a positive role in the stability of the world. Through international relations, we need to create equal opportunity for all, as well fight the bureaucracy and corruption. As people say in the island, responsibility has 6 syllables. Sure, one could argue that appraising words by their size is rather primitive, but the point remains intact. Regarding the nature of extent of insurgent solidarity, a key concept is the Cold War. We were allowed to talk about first, second, and sometimes third world. In PAGC, meaning this, the capitalism the first, socialism second, and non-aligned third. We think about this. In PAGC, we learned that was clear, that solidarity meant opposition to violence and discrimination. We enjoyed discussing the binational experience of struggle for the independence and development of Guinea and Cape Verde. However, it is clear that history, sometimes at least, unfolds in unpredictable ways. As it happens, colonialism had chosen its side by entering NATO. Our main source of material and moral support was the Second World, meaning the socialist countries, and the members of the Pact of Warsaw Pact. But there were many other solidarity committees spread all over the world, and this point is very important. Allow me to underline this. My own trajectory meandered through France, Belgium, and Netherlands before finally reaching African continent. Cabral himself claimed he was an anonymous soldier fighting for the human rights everywhere, thus signaling that the liberation movement, the liberation of the continent, was to come. Solidarity networks at the national and international level had considerable impact on the development of Cape Verde. For example, in the early years of independence, Cape Verde received aid or help from friendly countries in foodstuff which were marketed and with the product of their sale was used for national reconstruction. That is, at the same time that families were being employed, roads, dikes, and other infrastructure were being built. The national cooperative movements was also developed, and hundreds of production and consumption cooperatives were created, which supported the family economy. Adult literacy was decisive for the development of the country. At the time of independence, the illiteracy rate was 60%, whereas today it's 13%. Cape Verde has long recognized that although natural resources, emigration, foreign investment, and public development aid are necessary and likely to produce differentiated effects, no one is on equal footing, or this constitutes a replacement for education, which is the most important factor of economic growth, equity, and social cohesion, and moral development. Along the same lines, the important role of education in solidifying democracy and freedom is a fact that is currently and widely recognized. Nowadays, insurgent movements report back to the 50s with two differences. On the one hand, there was a radical shift in communication since the mid-80s, especially as it pertains to mobile phone services. This is used by the insurgent movements or like. On the other side, the nature of insurgencies and its objectives took a different direction. By no means can a terrorist organization be compared to a liberation movement. In fact, they are the opposite. The former is a pro-imperialistic system based on violence, and the latter is, as a rule, a struggle against colonialism. In reality, insurgent movements go parallel with terrorism. This is why insurgent solidarity has to be global in technical way. Sonia Borges' recent research is providing evidence that in specific cases we do not go straight from colonial order to a post-colonial one, whatever post-colonialism means. Her coming book on militant education, liberation struggle, consciousness, and underground education structure in Guinea-Bissau is probably going to give a contribution to radically change the way in which we understand the creation of knowledge and the new and view international relations, history, and social science. The book elaborates in great detail the concept of liberated zones. The army was composed simply by armed militants and people. Peace was the aim. Security, civil administration, agriculture, health, education, and defense were the main activities in liberated zones in Guinea-Bissau. Liberated zones were the land of dreams, which is a sort of utopian world that existed between 64 and 74, and under the leadership of Amílcar Cabral, alias Abel Jatsi, and inspired progressive changes in economic, social, and political fields in Cape Verde since 75. We do not have to forget that they owed their existence to the effort, the liberated zones, to the effort of PAIGC militants and people of Guinea-Bissau, to the assistance from the socialist countries, as well as of to dozens of help committees located in nearly all countries of the globe, including the United States and Scandinavian nations. In the island of Cape Verde, we were able to expand our national resources and freedom, even in the face of our imperfect democracy. The nation has been sovereign as of only 43 years. All nations experience crises, but some suffer more deeply. I am confident that the size at the size much, sorry, when it comes to development, but I believe that the pain is greater for micro, small, and medium states when the whole world finds itself in disarray, like at this moment. So please, let the president of your country, know, I mean United States, know, and the President of the United States and the main institutions know that we need many things. It's true, especially foreign investment. Nevertheless, if the condition sine qua non is the establishment of a military base, let us remain poor, respectable, and peaceful. I take this opportunity to send this message to every nation and world region. As it happens, this world will survive not by insurgent solidarity, but rather by global solidarity. How to find this, I don't know, but we'll try. It is a real possibility. Is this a real possibility? Is there a link between liberated zones of the past and universal solidarity? Is education, healthcare, productivity, and respect for identify the basis of lasting peace? This was meant a type of introduction to the liberation story of those two teeny nations, one which is considered an apparent success and the other is a failure. I mean, Cape Verde and Guinea-Bissau. We can discuss them, their liberated zones, and the theoretical meaning of this. Knowledge is more powerful, I am convinced, than military might, at least in Cape Verde. Would the leadership of this center be so kind as to consider the establishment of a permanent relationship with a University of Cape Verde? Please think about it. Inviting us has opened this possibility. Insurgent solidarity must be reinforced and universalized because the egoism and the dominant powers do the same. Moral strength is the soul of the Insurgent Solidarity, the real Insurgent Solidarity. The liberated zones were real. Think about this, and thank you very much. I suffered by this.
I will do the rest of presentation of Corsino because he needs to rest his voice, otherwise he cannot participate in the Q&A. So I will just read the PowerPoint, and Corsino also brought a very interesting film about the solidarity movement between Fidel Castro, Cuba, and Guinea-Bissau, and the origins of the Tricontinental Conference that happened in 1966, that then gave origin to the OSPAAL, the Organization of Solidarity with the Poor of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. So I will read the PowerPoint and also show the film, and then we are open for the debate. So it's working? Yeah. The title of the presentation of Corsino is that the liberated zones or liberated areas were real. And just to make a small resume about Corsino background. So Corsino comes from Cape Verde, which is an archipelago composed by 9 inhabited islands and located in about 400 miles of the west coast of African continent. Santantown is the northernmost of most island. PAGC was a liberation movement that was historically unique in its mission to simultaneously liberate 2 colonies, Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde. PAGC became known in 1961 when it was announced in London at a press conference organized by the Labour Party Solidarity. Amílcar Cabral, under the pseudonym of Abel Jassy, delivered his presentation. The armed struggle began in 1963. The unilateral independence of Guinea-Bissau was in 1973, although Portugal just recognized independence in 1974, and the independence the unilateral independence, the self-proclamation of independence happened in 1973, and by that time Cabral had been assassinated in January. In reality, the insurgency meant the national liberation movement. So when Corsino talks about the liberated zones, he means that liberated zones was located in the forest of Guinea-Bissau, and it meant a large area during the struggle which was proportional to the size of the country to the north, east, and south of Guinea-Bissau. It had the following characteristics: to mobilize and to serve as a model for future states, to be defended by its citizens, to provide the main services of agriculture, education, health, giving that it was a rural population, that it was illiterate and extremely poor. The liberation movement and the liberated zones had a very specific political function, and it was essential for the success of the liberation struggle. In retrospect, the liberation zone was a utopia, in the best sense of the term. It seemed prodigious, but it never came to fruition. The states of Guinea-Bissau in 1973 and Cape Verde in 1975, Guinea-Bissau that was independent in 1973 and Cape Verde in 1975, were devoid of any utopia because both countries separated and followed different paths. Geographically, the solidarity of the 50s, 60s, and 70s was universal, and alongside the national liberation movements were the people on the ground, the socialist countries, the non-aligned countries, the social democrats, and the solidarity communities in the remaining country, especially NATO members. For example, they were the freedom fighters who had always resided in the US, as well any other capitalist countries, we identified it with the home country and fought alongside it. Far from betraying their country of residence and labor, they defended human rights, and we are proud of them. From 1963 to 1980, there was a shared struggle for social transformation in Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde under the leadership of PAIGC. From 1980 on, the former was greatly hampered by military coup and ethnic conflicts, while the latter went on the path of unity and peace. However, today we ask if the national liberation struggle was deemed successful. How do we explain the prevailing situation of Guinea-Bissau, the social discrepancies in Cape Verde, and the relation between the two? So NATO has become unbalanced. A great nation attempts to equip schools with weapons. And Sonia Borges sets the example that we would like to follow through the world, choosing books over bullets. So I have two questions for Corsino. I'll just move there.
Good job.
Thank you. So Corsino is very modest. He didn't explain very well his path of how he got here or how he got to the liberation struggle. Because Corsino was born and raised in Cape Verde, and he lived there till his 20s. And then he escaped. He had some kind of escape to Portugal, because to leave Cape Verde and to go to Portugal to study, he needed permission from his parents, and if he faked the paperwork and just embarked to Portugal. And by the time the police state was searching for him, and they announced on the radio that they were searching for Corsino, who was already in Portugal. From Portugal, Corsino escaped to Belgium. And from Belgium, he escaped to Germany. And from Germany, he went to Guinea-Conakry. And then he went to Guinea-Bissau, where he joined the struggle. So all this path is made on a solidarity base. And while part of the struggle, he went to the Black Sea for the military training, if I'm not wrong. Am I right? So all this path is made on the solidarity that existed during this period of time. So from this experience in the 60s and 70s, I would like to ask Corsino about what is the changes, or how do you see solidarity from this particular period of time, and related with how we see solidarity today, or how you understand solidarity today?
Yeah, that's because of your question and the like. I prefer to think, to speak about solidarity, insurgent solidarity at that time, and think about what could be it. That is why I say that insurgent solidarity has to embrace the world, has to be global or universal, because that is where the state, capitalist state, or enterprise or whatsoever are. So we have to be universal and try to get it like we did before, So, yeah.
you. My second question it's about the liberated areas, because the title of your talk is that they existed. My question is, because you lived in these liberated areas, could you explain to us a little more about how do they function, how this network of solidarity worked inside the liberated areas in the context of a guerrilla struggle?
The solidarity, the insurgent solidarity in the liberated zones or areas, as you say, were based in people and militants, political militants of the PAGC. So that was the main element of this. After that, we had many support, usually not military, because military support came from the socialist countries at that time. But fundamentally, the food, for instance, soap, or the need we had to satisfy our needs, not military needs. So we had support committees everywhere. First, we had the solidarity between all over the world in the under colonialism. First, that was first. Second, we tried to have, especially the Scandinavian, and the Scandinavian means social democrats, finally. And of course, because the colonialist Portugal had chosen the camp, we need to choose one, and we were all over the world. I mean, trying to have the aid or the help from people. For instance, never you had a country like United States trying to help us, but you had the people of the United States doing that. And you can imagine the lens of this. Yeah.
Thank you. I don't know if the audience have any questions. If the audience has questions.
Okay.
Yes, Peter.
One of the problems now, not necessarily the creation of the liberated zone, but holding the zone. Like once it's created, the forces of reaction try to immediately take it away.
Well, yes. Military speaking is a very good question. we tried to save it by the people. I mean, in one colony, usually you have two opposite strands. And in that case, we concentrated in the liberated zones the main of our power, making a sort of frontier of border, avoiding the invasion, etc., etc. Yeah.
Any other questions? So, if not, we can show the film of this solidarity that emerged from the tricontinental from 1966 between Cuba and Guinea-Bissau, between Castro and Amílcar Cabral.
In January of 1966, only 2 months after Che retreated from the Congo, Cuba hosted an unprecedented gathering that included virtually every armed revolutionary movement from the 3 poorest continents. The Tricontinental Conference reinforced the island's role as the leader of internationalism. For Fidel, this was a good opportunity to assess the qualities of the revolutionaries he wanted to support. It was undoubtedly Amílcar Cabral who stole the limelight. Cabral, only 31 years old, was leading a fierce struggle against the Portuguese Empire in one of Africa's smallest and poorest nations, Guinea-Bissau.
Esta conferencia, aquí en Cuba, territorio libre de América, el primer país socialista en el hemisferio occidental, es en realidad una gran promesa, una gran esperanza para todos los pueblos que luchan contra el imperialismo.
Pero ya había un antecedente de Amílcar cuando se había entrevistado en el recorrido que hace Che por distintos países, que llega a Conakry y tiene la oportunidad de hablar con Amílcar. Y Che dice que uno de los movimientos de liberación más serios que hay en ese momento, de más posibilidad en ese momento, es el movimiento de liberación de la colonia de Guinea-Bissau y Cabo Verde.
Après les grands discours de Fidel Castro, Amílcar Cabral fait un discours remarquable. Il a caractérisé, je m'appelle ça, très bien la situation en Afrique, à partir de son propre pays, en parlant des ethnies, en parlant d'états de pauvreté, d'exploitation, pour justifier l'idée de conduire la liberté. C'est parce qu'il n'y avait pas autre voie, parce que les grandes puissances s'opposaient à l'indépendance de l'économie portugaise, par exemple.
For years, Amílcar's struggle was not of much consequence. But when the guerrillas started capturing territory, suddenly the importance of this neglected colony became evident. For Portugal, much more was at stake in Guinea-Bissau. This tiny colony could prove to be the empire's Achilles heel.
Y se liberaba Guinea-Bissau, y así se demostró después. Se desprendía la liberación del resto de los países de habla portuguesa colonizados. Entonces, allí estaba el eslabón más flojo que tenían de la cadena, desde el punto de vista de los portugueses. No podían permitir, tuvieron hasta que hicieron todo el esfuerzo para no permitir que se dejara ninguna de las colonias, y mucho menos Guinea iba a ser el ejemplo del resto de las colonias para su liberación.
Il n'y avait pas beaucoup de richesse. À ce moment-là, la Guinée devait recevoir de l'argent du agriculteurs. C'était des pays où on faisait l'agriculture, pas plus. L'agriculture arriérée, on faisait en Guinée. Tandis que ce n'était pas le cas en Angola, où il y avait des immigrés qui étaient commerçants, des hommes d'affaires. C'était des richesses de l'Angola et du Mozambique qu'ils voyaient, parce que Guinée n'ont rien fait.
The Portuguese were aware of their weakness, but they held the trump card. The government leased a strip of land on the Azores Islands to the U.S. Defense Department. That airbase was used to protect American allies in the east, like Israel and Saudi Arabia. But the lease was renewable annually, so Portugal had every intention to use the Azores airbase as a bargaining chip.
Well, under the fascist regime of Portugal, Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau were parts of Portugal. So the idea of giving up these colonies was unthinkable for that regime. So if we went to them and said, look, you must get out of Angola, we'll be very upset with you and all that, they might well have cut us out of the Azores. So NATO and the Cold War was far more important to us. There was a special law about not allowing U.S. arms given to Portugal to use them in Africa, but they did violate it, and we didn't do anything about it. In fact, we did not cut them off, even though we knew that they were using them.
Nous n'avons pas voulu nous mettre dans cette guerre-là entre l'Est et l'Ouest, nous n'avons pas voulu, non? Mais malgré que beaucoup de gens disaient que ce sont des communistes, beaucoup de gens disaient ça, mais on n'avait pas de preuves. Comme disait Amílcar, nous étions des nationalistes africains, sans son idéologique.
Amílcar knew that it would be difficult to avoid labeling his movement, and having Cuban fighters would do little to dispel the belief that they were firmly allied to the Eastern Bloc. But he had a vision and a very clear strategy as to how to fight his battle for independence.
Es decir, que Amílcar no llega pidiendo, deme hombre, mándeme hombre, ¿no? Teníamos la idea de que habíamos sacado ya del Congo, de que venían a venir más tropas de cubanos a ayudar a Amílcar. Y en aquel momento Amílcar no quería más tropas de cubanos.
Son los guineanos que tienen que luchar. Y supuestamente un batallón ahí va a ser el batallón y no los congresos. Tienen que aprender mediante la lucha, prepararse para la victoria. Es una idea muy, aunque fuera un poco más larga la lucha, pero una idea muy interesante de ir forjando en medio de la lucha la nación. Porque fueron una nación, además, tribus diferentes, solo la lucha por unirla.
Che's defeat in the Congo was still a fresh wound, and Fidel began to consider how his help could be more effective. This time, the bulk of Cuban support came in the form of artillery experts, doctors, and technicians. Soldiers would go only if requested.
They also took some lessons from the...
And we'll stop here with the foreign help of the doctors and all the other supply that it was, the solidarity that it was provided by the Cuban regime to the struggle of Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde. Corsino, do you want to say more words before we finish?
I am suffering of this vocal cords, and maybe if there is a question, I try to respond.
Is there any question? If not, I'll give the stage to Peter again. But thank you very much.
I've actually found that very inspiring, not just the history that it covers, but for the reminder that colonialism actually did not end right in the 60s and 70s, and that every struggle, however great the solidarity, requires vigilance to secure the gains that are made. My final announcement of the day, and you've heard way too much from me, is just a reminder about tomorrow again, which is to say that we've been thinking about how to organize breakout sessions in which the conversations initiated today could be deepened and extended. There are several themes that have emerged over the papers today, and I don't think they will all easily stick together, right? It's not that we're attempting some kind of unified theory of either insurgency or solidarity, but I do feel it's important that your voices participate in the discussions that we have tomorrow. And what we're going to attempt is to meet at 11 o'clock in 6112, right? That's the Sociology Lounge. And then figuratively break up into two, rather than absolutely break into two, for sessions that will be led by at least two of the people present today. And hopefully, you know, you will feel like wandering between these two sessions. In other words, that they don't feel that like you're locked into one should you participate in one. So the sessions are separate, but there'll be two parts within each session that I believe that will focus on different themes, and we'll announce the breakout between 11 and I guess 11:15 tomorrow morning. I'm not supposed to say that there'll be some form of sustenance available, but I do feel that after having struggled all day with coffee and I think there were a few Hershey Kisses out there. We haven't boycotted them yet. We might be interested in the idea that your participation will not leave you with an empty stomach. That said, thank you again for attending today and participating today. And since solidarity is a process, let that process continue tomorrow. Thank you.